2016. She has been Vice President of International Association for the Study of Forced Migration. Ma'am, we are really privileged to have you with us. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you so much for that generous, I don't think it's necessary, but very, very generous, introduction of all the chairs, I must say, Vishwajit. So this is very unusual, especially where I come from. I think, we are just doing our job, and such, introductions are not necessary, I think. But thank you nonetheless. Let me just take 2 minutes to kind of, not wrap up, but just to suggest that, today is the last, session, panel, roundtable. It's a roundtable. It's a culmination. And I'm actually not worried of the post-lunch, because the speakers that we have in this roundtable, they are very, very courageous, and their works speak for themselves. So I'm not going to go into too much of introduction at all. But before that, I think the session is very, very promising. And I'm very happy to actually note that migration is something is catching the interest of everyone now. And I think Paula, Nergis, Anupam will all bear with me when we say that migration initially was just seen as a subject which is something like related to geography or related to something, not necessarily political science so much, or like So I'm very happy to note that everybody is talking about migration in some sense. And I'm more than happy actually that CRG's work is being really, really not only quoted, but it's about time, because given that it's an institution that not only that I belong to, but somewhere in terms of its research, it's been on the map, and I think its contribution is well recognized and articulated, published, accepted. But somewhere this is kind of a very, very important and a win-win situation where I come from. So again, I'm so grateful to Vishwajit to take it, for taking this burden, I would say, and of course the vote of thanks, all that will happen later. But I think it's very important to recognize that when CRG proposed this, and I think this afternoon will actually bear out all of that, because it's a post lunch, as Vishwajit was saying, and then also a round table, and then also on methodology. So nobody wants to listen about methodology, but as I said, the three speakers that we have, Paula, Nergis, and last but not the least, Anupama, who's been so kind to me, because the first two are very dear friends, so I can ride roughshod over them, I know that. But Anupama has been very, very generous to me. She's never turned me down on anything that I have really asked, be it a session that to be part of. And I think they all the three speakers are very, very capable, that they don't need to be introduced. But formally, I would say just a couple of lines, just 2, 3. Paula is a former Vice Chancellor of Sanskrit University. She teaches in Calcutta University. She's a professor. Her work is widely quoted on gender, on migration, and Northeast, actually, border, which I think, which was one of the main issues, but I think something that, it's very, very done very, very well, and especially on the Northeast part that we don't talk so much about. Anupama, of course, professor at, CPS, I'm not going to go there, but 2, 3 points. The work on citizenship, for somebody like me, when I really initially began, I didn't have the route to kind of, where do we navigate? And nobody was really talking about migration and citizenship. So her work actually became that anchor to kind of, push us to think that, okay, some things is going on, and maybe we need to even push the envelope. So gender, migration, citizenship, I think all of that actually I can attribute, especially now migration, I can attribute to you, Anupama, I think, So I don't think that is going to be a major, major issue there. Nergis Kandafe is a very dear friend again, and I'm so happy to see you. You are, well, not in Canada, I know you're in Istanbul. She's been a bit unwell, but I'm very happy to see you again here to join us. She's actually got 2 PhDs. Okay, we all struggle with 1 PhD. She was very, very brave enough and to go for another one on law. And she's been, well, if I'm not correct, if I'm not mistaken, you got the degree 2 years ago, right? And you didn't need to do it, but I think you really wanted to. So she's primarily public policy, but an expert in law. And that's something that she wanted to do. And she's actually the student of Howard Edelman, and I'm not going to go into the names that exist, but I'm sure it shows in her work. Paul, theorist, constitutional lawyer, a lot of other stuff. So again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you. I really appreciate the fact that all of you were kind enough to say yes on a topic that was very dear to all of us. I know methodology. I won't just say methodology. I think it's important to round it up and saying pedagogy. So I think Paula wants to go last. So let's just begin with, is it okay if I start with you, Anupama, or would Nergis, whoever wants to go first?
It's fine by me either way.
Okay, Nergis. Okay, great. So we'll start off with Nergis, who is also, incidentally, if I didn't mention, she is a faculty in York University, Canada. Okay, so Nergis will go, and then we have Anupama, and then Paula can come in. Is that okay, Paula? Is that fine? That's fine. Yeah. And how long do we have, Vishwajit, for how many minutes? Just so that I know they are excellent speakers. So any time limit is not going to work for them. So I know that in their own way. So 20 minutes is okay?
25, 20,
oh,
20
great.
to 20 minutes is fine. Yeah.
Okay, 25. So the time is not the issue here. So please. Yeah. All right. Thank you again. And Nergis, let's start with you. I don't have a question, I said, but I think you can set up the tone of the discussion, and then we can get take it from there, because it's a round table. So I just leave it to you. Thank you, Nergis.
Okay. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure and also an honor. Anytime I physically or virtually cross the continent and then get back to Delhi or Kolkata, I feel like I'm really in the right place. I belong. So the sentiment continues. I really appreciate this opportunity. So what I wanted to talk about today continues with Nesrin's generous introduction. 2 PhDs, 5 PhDs, or 0 PhDs, it doesn't matter. My lifetime work is concentrated on state criminality and regimes of accountability. So how do you render states and political institutions accountable for mass crimes or systemic political violence or structural annihilation of populations? So my work, training, education, as well as activist work on the ground allowed me to see different aspects of how states and various institutions, as well as societies themselves, do everything possible to avoid accountability. And there are various technologies of framing problems in such a way that they no longer are seen as existing, or they are rendered irrelevant or past or marginal or not within the main domain of issues that need to be focused. So I'm going to structure my comments within that framework in relation to migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless people at the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the things that caught my attention, I'm currently editing a special issue on the subject with a bunch of international migration experts. We're looking at global dimensions of how refugees and migrants and displaced populations are affected. And it was brought to my attention, and I also came to it myself. Most of the current publications on migrant and refugee health post-COVID-19 is actually published in medical journals. The reason being, obviously, the usual actors cannot go out to the field. Even UNHCR is operating on a very minimalist kind of authority and power, and the people who usually send their grad students or academics who usually work in the field, including advocates and activists, are basically forced to remain behind the barricades, so to speak. And so it's almost like a war in many ways for migrants, refugees, and displaced people. COVID-19, I think, really equates into a warlike situation. So it's meant to be a biomedical disease with serious physical, mental health implications. It's meant to be rapidly spreading. A World Health Organization identified that out of the 196 countries, 80 of the countries are refugee hosting countries. These are identified refugee populations, displaced populations, and all of them are very high risk for pandemic spread. Now, what's interesting is that kind of information comes from World Health Organization and not from the nation states themselves, because within the nation state rhetoric, refugees, displaced people, and to a certain degree, migrant workers are not counted as the mainstay population towards which you have to develop measures and engage in prevention activities. So this is the, the crux of the matter, in the sense that the pandemic rendered the populations who are dispossessed and displaced all the more invisible, to the point of full-blown necropolitics, where nobody is accountable. Absolutely nobody is accountable, because there's a crisis situation and national populations are on high alert in terms of their own survivals. And I read about 10 or 12 medical papers, and I'm not medically trained, but I tried to use my educational facilities to understand what they are trying to deliver. And most of them are on in very clear terms, indicating that it will take about 35 to 100 days for a refugee camp to be decimated in the event that it's hit by the virus. There is no infrastructure. There are virtually none to very little intensive care units. And the dispatchment of medical personnel at the best of times is very limited. I'm not even talking about living conditions of the displaced, even if they're not in the camps. If you're talking about urban refugees, if you're talking about stateless. And I believe the Rohingya population is used as a sample, because there's quite a body of Médecins Sans Frontières personnel on the ground to do the calculations, so to speak. And they do the medical calculations. And what they're indicating is that in the long run, if the pandemic continues in the way that it does, and eventually it will get to the displaced and dispossessed populations, it will virtually decimate them. We are not talking about just deaths, because the death rate could go up to 10% or so, but we're talking about long-term implications and comorbidities and chronic health issues, as well as mental health issues. It also indicates the fact that once these people are infected, they will be practically inadmissible in any circumstance. So we're actually talking about the erection of a very new border regime. There was a long-standing debate about refugees and asylum seekers who were HIV positive or who had disabilities not to be admitted, especially in certain settings whereby they would be considered as a burden to the healthcare system. With COVID-19, this will multiply 100-fold, because we're talking about large populations who may well be infected while they're in situ waiting for admission or screening or work permits or residential permits. So and one might say, listening to the keynote this morning, what is the difference between migrant workers and refugees and asylum seekers and displaced people? Well, the difference is the first category, which was the topic of the discussion in the morning, is semi-recognized in terms of status and rights. So they actually have permission to work. They have permission to move within the country or to leave. Whereas the stateless and the asylum seekers and the displaced and the dispossessed, not just in the camps, but in limbo, have none of these rights. So they're at the mercy of the societies that they're within, which increases the possibility of state criminality combined with societal negligence tenfold. So, I mean, this is a global problem, and I would like to be more specific about the Indian context, for which I would need to do more work. But I will give you some numbers that are amazingly, I would say, obvious as to what's happening. For instance, within the United States, we're talking about 6 million migrant and or non-status people who are working frontline in the health industries. 6 million. These are people who are directly exposed to COVID-19 on a daily basis, and they have special work permits to do so. Now, none of this is discussed in the American politics. And then you would say, why are you giving the example of United States? Because United States, for the last 3-4 years, have been viciously against asylum seekers, and it's been engaged in various farcical border policies. Now, despite that, as we speak, we're talking about 6 million migrants, asylum seekers, workers employed in health industries, and these are considered disposable workers because they have special status to be working in health industries, and they don't have the kind of benefits and then the buffer and whatever else would be available for native workers, so to speak. And we're talking about not just doctors and nurses, but we're also talking about technicians. We're talking about hospital clearance stuff. We're talking about morgue workers. We're talking about people who do the undertaker job when people die. There's a whole host of jobs within health industries that emerged in multitude with the pandemic, which are not performed by native workers. The majority of these, a very large number of these, are actually non-status people or special permit asylum seekers or people in limbo. The same is true for the Middle East. The same actually is true for Canada. As the pandemic hit in March, by April and May, we actually saw the emergence of a special regime whereby asylum seekers were given special permits to work on in old age pension homes and hospitals and care units where nobody would approach except the army. So very interesting formations we are witnessing, but this is kind of it's almost like this is the positive side of the whole picture. The negative side of the picture is I am regularly checking the news coming out of Mary Kaldor Center in Australia. And one of the issues concerning displaced people and dispossessed people who are kept in detention centers en masse is that now there is even the refusal of doctors and healthcare personnel to be entering into these units with the fear that they will then be carrying the virus out. And these units are practically sealed from the society. At the best of times, they have been problematic, but at the moment, the way that they are treated is virtually going back to 18th century penitentiary practices. If people die, people die. They'll be buried in the detention centers. There will not be the provision of basic healthcare services while they're waiting there. And Australia has long been engaged in offshore refugee warehousing. And the same issue takes place in those places as well. Now, I mean, many of these stories are in so many ways, how shall we say, they capture attention. And I'm not so much interested in the stories other than the fact that they provide an inlet to a much larger issue, which is the rendition of the invisibility of large masses of populations. We're not talking about individuals, we're talking about specific communities of vulnerability. And this is a chronic condition. And what the pandemic also allows is, because the academic activist and or NGO intervention is not possible at the moment in terms of witnessing the occurrence of these events and or policies and strategies, they are rendered virtually invisible. The list of priorities have changed globally in terms of death rates and transmission rates and new border policies and limitation of entry and exit. And therefore, even at the best of times, these populations were invisible. At the moment, they virtually do not exist. So one of the things that happens in terms of continued efforts to curb the spread of the coronavirus is that the severe travel restrictions have become normalized, which basically means the end of international asylum system. You cannot cross a border at the moment, and even UNHCR negotiating for expediting emergency cases is coming back with an empty hand. All of the 196 states at the moment are either fully closed in terms of border regimes or largely closed, which means that the human corridor if you think of international migration, in particular forced migration, as a continual flow, which we have been arguing for decades now, it's not esoteric, it's not asymptomatic, it's not a singular event. It's actually the very thing that keeps the state system alive, in the sense that it keeps absorbing the populations which become victims of societal and state violence. And it creates buffers of survival, no matter how minimal that is. So that flow is the very channel through which targeted and marginalized sectors of the societies have been surviving since the Second World War. So with the travel restrictions in place and border regimes really being strict, what is not known is what kind of accumulation is happening across the borders. And so for my Indian counterparts and colleagues here, I don't know the information, I don't have the data, but perhaps you can enlighten me about what is happening at the border areas, because that flow does not stop. And, and in that sense, this pandemic allows us to ask different kinds of questions, which we may not have been having the luxury of prior to the pandemic, in the sense that it makes certain ugly things so much more visible. So for instance, across the central Mediterranean since 2015, we had about an estimated 16,000 asylum seekers drowning in the sea. And this is like the body count, the number estimated to be about 3 times more than that. And this was happening in the context of rescue operations. Since COVID-19, all rescue operations have come to a halt. So the bodies are not even counted anymore, right? So prior to that, at least we had some degree of body count, at least we had some degree of visibility. At the moment, people are still trying to cross from Libya and Turkey, and they're drowning, and there is no rescue operation. Border patrol is not going around, except, the borders are gunned. But there is no operation in the sea. So people are dying silently and drowning silently, and there's no number. And so in many ways, this is seen as a collateral damage of this pandemic. But my contention is that this is a natural consequence of the way that we've established this regime of survival, suffering combined. And crisis planning and trajectories and policy making in none of the nation states, or the 76 or 80 nation states, which are historic refugee hubs, none of them have any reference whatsoever to the predicament of the stateless and the displaced people at their borders, within their borders. This issue is unspoken for, it's unannounced, and in many of the policies that are subject to public discussion, it is not even brought to the attention of the public, because the public is already suffering from collapse or weakening of the national healthcare system, which in neoliberal systems already operates at the kind of the very fragile point, that the tipping point is so minimal. It's only for severely sick people and a very small percentage of the population. So the healthcare system is already overburdened, and therefore the state, whether in the global north or the south, really avoids mentioning displaced populations, dispossessed populations that do not have citizenship, as that would be seen as an overburdening of the already very fragile and breaking down system. So I have a few questions. I'm looking at the time here. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. Okay. So, I mean, I can go on and on about the details of the condition in different continents. And I mean, with the Calcutta group, one of the topics of discussion which really endeared me over the last 15 years or so is that South-South migration is of major importance. We have to remove the lens from the global kind of panopticon established by the North in terms of defining and understanding migration, etc., etc. Those are par for the course for this particular conglomeration of esteemed colleagues. So I'm not going to go there. But one of the things that I'm working on right now is there's a notion called ethics of witnessing, and this is often taken as testimonial accounts, right? Or in legal education, you basically give a training on legal ethics to young lawyers, especially human rights lawyers, as to their responsibility towards the society, because what they're witnessing is the underbelly of the society and the worst source of criminality that the state engages with. And therefore, they may not be able to do more than witnessing and documenting and archiving and saving, but nonetheless, that's a huge responsibility. So the last month or so, I'm actually working on a kind of large scale web tool, which could be used internationally in open access, which looks at developing certain core practices of ethics of witnessing for people who work with especially forced migration. And the kind of data that I came across basically looks at most of the strategies used by Médecins Sans Frontières, frontline workers, NGOs, advocates. And the core of the discussion there is no harm principle, all right? So the communities that we work with are identified as highly vulnerable. There's also power differential in place. And so there are some practical suggestions as well as a fairly stringent review process as to how you work with these populations and how you could fulfill your obligation of witnessing and documenting. And the more I looked at these, the more I felt like, but what's the larger question? All right. You know, these stringent rules and regulations themselves do not necessarily help us understand the larger question as to why are we engaging in research? What kind of questions are we actually asking in terms of what we're looking at? Why are we studying these populations? Where do we feed our information to? Do we actually go back to, let's say, a state university and discuss it among our colleagues and then share it with our students, and then therefore our witnessing capabilities and obligations end there? Do we create an international database as to how many people in which forms are suffering, and do we therefore in effect provide a feedback to the very state, which is both responsible and accountable, but also not doing what it needs to be doing? And what angle do we use? Do we look at these populations as a potential future citizens? Do we look at the problem as a global issue? And what that means at the time of pandemic is we cannot be out there at the moment. So how do we do the witnessing while we cannot be out there at the moment, and we cannot document, we cannot reach out? And while all this horrendous level of atrocities happening, that I only gave an inkling of you know, the degree to which people are dying and disappearing and have absolutely no access to healthcare. So how do we engage at this time of pandemic with large scale mass displacement and strictly speaking, legally vulnerable populations? And I want to qualify the term vulnerability here. There's a certain philosophical tradition, especially in Anglo-American academia, that discusses vulnerabilities, and it has its counterparts in the Indian academia as well, and intellectuals. I'm not defining vulnerability in that sense. I'm defining vulnerability in a potentially redeemable way. These are individuals and communities who have grievable lives. Nonetheless, they have been declared non-grievable. And that's a very interesting term, because being able to grieve someone when they die is not considered a luxury, but in effect for the dispossessed and the displaced, it is indeed a luxury. When they die, nobody knows. There's no count. Even the community itself does not know. So I define vulnerability in the sense that it's our failing, not their position. Their position does not render them vulnerable. It's our failing as societies that actually create these vulnerabilities. So I'm going to end with a few questions for us to think together. So, I mean, in terms of law and justice in the context of COVID-19 related global crisis, as it affects and continues to differentially target refugees and forced migrants, what kind of general sense could be developed in terms of reshaping our social practices and imaginaries, and in terms of at least thinking about new possibilities concerning the conditions of the dispossessed despite the pandemic. Because this is a lull period, we're locked in. We cannot be out there unless you're a healthcare worker. Even the universities are shut down virtually everywhere. I'm in the Middle East, everything is online. We don't see people. This is 7 months now, and I'm sure this is the same for you. Never mind working with refugee groups or even in the legal profession, the bar associations are closed. So what can we actually think about reshaping our current social practices? Because what the pandemic revealed is that at a time of crisis, they are the first collateral damage. They are virtually rendered non-existent. The second question that I would like to pose is developing a multifaceted understanding of the global crisis related to pandemic. And this was brought up in the keynote this morning. In a way, it opens up new and different entry points to all problems. So, I mean, there are certain things that we can start discussing with younger generations of scholars and advocates in our fields in terms of what they think we should do for approaching this unprecedented situation, which is nonetheless leading to aggravated difficulties for displaced populations to an unimaginable level. What I'm trying to say is there has to be a leg of engaging with younger populations, especially our students, in terms of asking them these questions, because in so many ways, I know this is going to sound morbid, but I'm in my 50s, right? So maybe another 15, maybe another 20 years that I'll be doing this work, but this world is inherited by the next generation. And this is a very big problem for them. And instead of trying to come up with all the answers ourselves, I have a feeling that pedagogically and otherwise, we really should ask these big questions to them, because that's going to be their universe and that's going to be their problem. And if you look at the numbers of populations on the move, majority of which are vulnerable, that is really the new class dimension, which was again mentioned in the opening talk. I mean, the next question is, there is a new geography emerging in terms of the overlapping of death and dispossession. That there's a standard term used for that, and that is basically the term of necropolitics, right? But necropolitics is often used in terms of north-south relations or in the context of racism par excellence. So what I'm wondering is whether we can actually talk about death and dispossession overlapping within the larger context of racial, economic, social inequalities combined with displacement. Because most of the necropolitics discussion is actually stationary. It looks at one given society and looks at historical inequalities. What I'm wondering is, as migration scholars, we can actually talk about the global overlap of movement, dispossession movement, and that in a more systemic way. There are other questions that I have in mind, which I think is going to occupy my next 6 months or so. The business of human suffering, in addition to its voyeuristic value, which seems to be almost like a Greek drama. I mean, most societies feel almost satisfied by having the chance of watching people suffer. I don't mean anyone takes enjoyment, but the fact that you get to see it, it's almost like as if you're doing something. By way of being aware, you feel like you're kind of fulfilling some sort of mysterious obligation that you acknowledge they exist. So what needs to be done is, I think I'm going to go back to one of the examples I gave about 6 million people in United States alone working in healthcare industries. There has to be a rude awakening that without these displaced people who are on the move, most of the societies cannot function in the way that they do. There's a cost of not looking after them and not including them in a much more inclusive regime of labor rights and other rights. And the last one that I'm going to put on the table is this business of warehousing refugees and dispossessed people. I think we really have to start a discussion in earnest in terms of mapping out global geographies of these warehouses and detention centers, and basically creating an industry of numbers and places and names. And that goes back to my mentioning of ethics of witnessing, because right now they're invisible. They are literally rendered invisible under the pandemic conditions. They're not a priority for states. They're not a priority for societies. NGOs and INGOs cannot operate. And we're talking about millions of people. I actually call them the country of nowhere. When you put together all the refugee camps and detention centers, they do make up a huge country. That does not exist on the map, and yet it's all around us. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nargis. I think you've raised a very, very pertinent points to kind of get the discussion rolling. Institutional accountability, vulnerability, pandemic, dispossession, criminality. I think all of it actually weaves in a lot of points for discussion. And I think what ties it all together is, especially what is prevailing in the present day scenario, is, there's the ethics of witnessing. I think I really appreciate that, correlation of the conjoinment that you're suggesting, that where there seems to be a kind of a voyeurism that is happening, where, we are counting deaths literally, and what really goes on thereafter, what really happens. So it is happening perhaps minus responsibility, minus taking into, so there's no cognizance of what really could have been done to prevent it. Rather, what we are kind of getting into is, okay, this has been done. But I think what the pandemic, as you very rightly said, has really stopped that aspect, and rather it has taken a very new normal where accountability has been completely suspended at that point. So where the dead in the sea who are being counted are not being counted anymore. So any kind of dignity that they probably would have got is they prevented from it. So I think your questions are very, very pertinent. I'm sure some of them will be like, especially, I don't think we've discussed so much about law and justice, in terms of responsibility, in terms of, where is all this heading towards? We are now actually living in a limbo. We are in in a lockdown, unlock, and I don't know what the terminologies are. So we are, kind of a state of exception in some sense. We are living through that exception in some way. So, and I think some of the questions of necropolitics, I think that's a very good point, maybe, Anupama and all, but these are issues that I think you have brought it to the table for further discussion and further engagement. And I personally, I can say that I appreciate, and I'm sure the August House that we are in would really, take the conversation further. So without much ado, let me, welcome Anupama Roy. Anupama, the floor is all yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nasreen, and thank you, Biswajit, both of you, for inviting me to be part of this panel. And thank you, Nargis, for that very evocative presentation. You have left us with numerous questions, and I'm sure towards the end of the roundtable, we would be able to respond to some of them. I am not going to respond directly to the context of the pandemic, but I hope to raise certain concerns, particularly concerns around methodology, which would help us look at categories that we are using nonetheless in the context of the pandemic. And much of these categories that I'm going to kind of discuss in the next 15-20 minutes come from my own bit of research along what I would call different fields of inquiry. And these fields of inquiry, I would argue, constitute anthropological sites And I call them anthropological sites because each of these sites that I'm going to talk about are accumulated differently, configured differently. They are talking about different things, but they can all be linked together through this figure of the migrant. So the figure of the migrant is the ubiquitous figure that kind of congeals what appear to be disconnected sites. So one of the categories, therefore, that I'm going to throw up before the panel and the audience is the category of heterogeneities. And how do we deal with, how do we relate to heterogeneities, which seem to be talking different things at the same time, but are also connected in a way to make us, as Nargis said, look at them through solidarity. So is there a category which we could perhaps think of, which helps us bring all these different sites together, the refugees, the asylum seekers at the borders, the state formative practices and border making practices, and the kind of border sealing and reconceptualizing of the border as has been kind of precipitated through the pandemic effect. So we need to think of the times that we are living through as maybe a temporary time, as Nasreen said, that we are in a state of limbo, or maybe as a liminal phase. Where we are, we don't know yet, but we are at a threshold, looking towards something that we cannot fathom yet. So the category of heterogeneities and liminality is something that I would ask us to work with, and particularly in this context, the figure of the migrant. And the figure of the migrant through the three anthropological sites that I would be discussing is not the obverse of the citizen. No, it's not somebody. The figure is not constituted of categories that are absent, in the sense that they do not reflect or manifest the absence of citizenship. They fall in that shadowy zone, the penumbra of citizenship, I would want to call that, because there is this universal referent of the citizen, and the migrant is at the in this penumbra of citizenship, and constantly has to reconstitute itself in relationship with its absolute identity of the citizen. So what are these processes that we are talking about that makes it possible for a migrant to be simultaneously looked at as a citizen? So that is one problem that I think we need to be also worried with. Now, the three sites that I'm talking about are specific to the research that I have done, but I'm sure there would be categories that this research would communicate for a shared kind of conversation among us. The three sites that I'm going to talk about are, one is the site of transnational migration of a specific kind, marriage migration, and marriage migration again from a specific lens of abandonment. So I think the category of abandonment in this process becomes important, because Nargis also referred to the abdication of institutional responsibility, and how this abdication is, in a fundamental sense, the kind of institutional responsibility and accountability that the state ought to have. And what is it that the state means, for example, when it says that it hasn't kept any data on people who migrated or were internally displaced in the context of pandemic? What kind of responsibilities is the state giving up when it says that it hasn't kept any data? So there is a kind of, therefore, abandonment would be one category that I would ask us to kind of look at. Now, in the work that I did, I looked at abandonment of women who were in a negotiated transnational marriage. And the process of abandonment was, in a sense, also a legal process, because the women were excluded from the legal frameworks of recognition in transnational marriages, and they had no recourse to law to restore them or give them any kind of whatever kind of compensation the women required. And again, here the methodology that one used was, this was a research that was done in collaboration with colleagues in Lincoln University and York University, a doctoral student in York University, Harshita Yalamarti, and Anita Sundari in York University. And what we did was that we talked to these women who were abandoned in India, and they did not, as was promised to them, they did not migrate with their husbands to, the countries that we were looking at was UK. And the abandonment, the states where abandonment happened was Gujarat, Punjab, and Delhi. Now, this particular, the methodology that we used, one of life history, was a strategic methodology. And again, going back to what Nargis said earlier, how do we now, the methodology that we considered appropriate for, talking to people about their life experiences in a way which was non-hierarchical and allowed people to recall the incremental or signposts, the critical, the points in their lives where they experienced hierarchies of power, or they were forced to make a decision, or they were in violent situations, and how the co-participants in the construction of this history tried to make this as egalitarian as possible. But it demanded that there was a face-to-face establishment and installation of trust between those who were in conversation, including the researcher and the person who had suffered abandonment. So that kind of a possibility is perhaps missing at this point. But there is a possibility that still exists in the kind of parallel documentation of experiences of abandonment in the context of the pandemic, where you have people keeping diaries, journalists who have walked with the migrants and kept diaries of the daily, the torment of moving from one kind of uncertainty to another kind of uncertainty. They're not too sure whether they would be, their home states would be hospitable to them. So there is a chronicling that has happened. But again, there are other kind of expressions, the artistic expressions of loss, of abandonment, of moving by people who are not experiencing, but people who are witnessing. So there's again another a witnessing that is happening. For some of us, it's a ringside witnessing. For others who are attempting to be part of that experience. But as researchers who are looking at the phenomena of an unprecedented phenomena of displacement of large numbers of workers, it is kind of it's extremely difficult for us to in a context where everybody is in a state of isolation, dissociation, to construct a framework where this can be communicated empathetically, and it can also be visibilized in a way that enough pressure is put on how policy decisions ought to be taken. Now, there is, again, when I make this point about policy decision, I'm coming from our own research in the context of abandoned women, where our research was presented to a parliamentary committee, and it made changes. It became instrumental to changes in the in the laws where the ambit of domestic violence was expanded to include abandonment as a form of violence. So the recognition of abandonment as a culturally specific crime, however, presented to us again the kind of ethical dilemma that Nargis refers to, because all our research is going to lead at an outcome where violence of a specific kind is going to be seen as culturally specific, and would therefore somehow fit into the colonial rescue drama. And it could also have ramifications for how immigration policies are framed in the context of South Asian countries. So again, the issue of ethics, apart from the fact that how are we going to represent the trauma of a person who's abandoned, or whether revisiting the trauma is at all ethical, or what kind of the assurance that this is an academic feminist praxis is also about making what is invisible visible as, and that entire exercise can perhaps be seen as a feminist academic praxis. So the issue of ethics was extremely important. And we did also, and again, I would come to the issue of law that Nargis raised. What were the reasons? What was in a context of stigmatization? If you again look at the pandemic effect, the bodies, the migrants were in some senses contagious bodies. They were being made visible in a way that they produced risks to people. They were risky bodies. They were going to be potentially risky to where they were destined, and they were potentially risky in a context where they had aggregated, they had congregated. So they were risky people. They were contagious populations, and they were being kind of counterpointed with another kind of body, which was the frontline warrior, which happened to be the ASHA worker, again disempowered in the context that of the pandemic, not holding powers of negotiation with the state, not being paid, not having the power of large trade unions that are affiliated to large political bodies, but they were being made the frontline warriors. So there is this entire context in which the particular site of displacement in the context of the pandemic was configured, and I can immediately draw correspondence between what we did in the context of abandonment and the kind of abandonment that we see in the context of the workers who were displaced and abandoned by their governments. Now, in this context, again, with in the research on abandoned women, two categories became extremely important, and these categories were one of mobility and motility. Now, so whether the person who is mobile really has the capacity to move, and what is it that has compelled or constrained a person to move? So with the abandoned women, for example, the entire context of mobility was constrained because they were not the initiators of the movement. So who is it that initiates mobility? There are some who have the capacity to initiate, and therefore they would become the hyper-visible, negotiating, entrepreneurial, flexible citizens of the global cities. Or there would be others who would be totally imprisoned, because they cannot initiate their own mobility. So here we have a mobile population that is the migrant population that is moving, it's mobile, but it does not have any control over its mobility. So there is a question of motility that perhaps one can raise in the context of the immobile, mobile migrants. The other category that I thought was is important for our discussion is the way in which one would look at the question of the family. So there is the powerful images of entire families moving, with the barest minimum resources that they have, are powerful images. But we also need to see how in law and in policy of rehabilitation, this category of family is incorporated into law or in public policy. Now, one of the things that we noticed, particularly in the context of another site, the second site that I would want to refer to, is the migration, crossing of borders again by a mobile population, in the context of the exchange of population and territory following the Land Border Agreement Treaty between India and Bangladesh. And Nasreen is very familiar with the area that I'm talking about, particularly the camps of the returnees in Cooch Behar, and those in the enclaves that did not go to Bangladesh and stayed on to become Indian citizens. Now, in this context, the category of the family is important because what was earlier in Bangladesh, for those Indians who chose to come and reside in the camps in Cooch Behar, the nuclear families were aggregated to make one single family to kind of dilute the amenities that they would receive. So if there were 4 families that were living separately in Bangladesh, upon their return to India, and they, in the process of rehabilitation and their accommodation in camps, these families were put together, and the amount of rations that they were given became less because of this accumulation. So the way in which the family is seen is important. And I'm reminded of another excellent piece by Ranabir Samadar some time back in the context of the enumeration of Indian citizens through the NRC, and how he looks at the category of the family in the context of the border policing that was happening, as halting the power that the family would have, because this particular person can be extracted and individuated and taken out of the family and made suspect. So Sanmadar refers to the diminution of the power of the family in a context where the family is not able to absorb somebody who would be rendered through that absorption, who can be decriminalized through that absorption into the family. So the category of the family then I would propose is an important category that we need to keep in mind. Again, in the context of the pandemic, where the folding in and folding up of public spaces has made the space of the domestic and the space where the family is supposed to reconstitute and rejuvenate itself, as a reprieve that the pandemic has provided. What or how do we look at that space in the present context? And I'm particularly reminded of the situation immediately before the pandemic. Now, I'm reminded of the anti-CAA protests And I'm also reminded of the huge demonstration that was held against against disinvestment by trade unions across the country. And what happened with the pandemic, the effect that the pandemic had, was to fold everything up into the private space or into the virtual space and make the home department of the government more pronounced than any other department or any other ministry of the government, so that conditions of extreme necessity could be presented, and those conditions of extreme necessity could be made the foundations for regimes that would be unaccountable regimes that could unleash surveillance on populations, and regimes that people would consent to and participate in. So the issue of law then becomes important, particularly in this context where laws to contain epidemic or laws to build capacity of people to address conditions of disaster, the two laws that govern the particular moment that we are living in, the Disaster Management Act and the Epidemic Act, which is, of course, a colonial law. These laws then assume the kind of primacy that would override any other democratic process, be it the electoral process, because all election laws and electoral governance would now have to conform to these extraordinary contexts of the pandemic. Now, so the last thing that I would want to, the last point that I would want to make before this panel is to again come to the question of evidence. And evidence as seen in research, the question that we ask ourselves always, what is the kind of data that you've connected? What is the way in which that data has been collected? And what can be construed as evidence for any kind of research that could lead to generalizations? And both with life history research, the question of evidence becomes important because what is it that we are looking at? We are looking at incremental recall. Another kind of evidence that I've looked at in other research earlier is evidence that is stored in the archives, the official evidence that's about the footprints of the state, what residues the state leaves while it's administering people. And in this context, the preoccupation of the state in guarding its borders to make certain kinds of people legible and protect populations against people who would be considered potentially dangerous becomes important. And the questions that I would ask again with Nargis, along with Nargis, is to see how do we read these laws? How do we read these laws? Do we read these laws in the context of the power, the legitimacy of the body that makes these laws is concerned, so that these laws would be seen to have legitimate effect? Or do we evaluate them? Not just the laws, but also the kind of effects that these laws produce. Do we evaluate them on along anchors that would be that talk about justice, that talk about norms? So what is then that? Where do we look for justiciability of laws that everybody is complying with? So the question of consent then becomes important, and that's what I want to leave the panel with. That last question. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anupama. I'm not going to sum up, but just kind of highlight some of the key points so that kind of it will help in connecting after Paula's remarks. I think you've very well you've set the stage in a in a way, in bringing in the question of the anthropological sites, the three anthropological sites, and the question of certain kind of categories, which is a figure of a migrant, the manner in which a woman's body becomes a site of contestation through in the marriage case, in the case of marriage, where you talk about abandonment, and then you weave it in the whole idea of law, as in what does it do to the law? I mean, the whole idea of justiciability, or the idea that whether it is making it legible versus illegibility. So this is a very good way of examining what methodology it becomes important for us to invoke to do certain kind of research. And I don't think we could have heard it from a better person than you. Thank you so much. So with those remarks, I go to Paula. Paula, it's all yours.
Yeah, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, please.
Okay, lovely. I mean, it's very, very difficult to speak after Nargis and Anupama. I mean, they've been both evocative and very analytical. So I will not address specifically the issues that have been raised, but I will sort of speak to it. Citizenship, etc., that have emanated, and of course the migrant body that have emanated as a result of this pandemic. Now I'm sorry, because on my computer it's showing that my connection is unstable, so bear with me. If I go out, I'll try to come back. So I, just a cautionary note. When the pandemic started, with a 4 hour of declaration, we all know how the lockdown started without any preparation, anything. I mean, I was sort of completely washed out because the day before my father had passed away, as I was telling Anupama. So I didn't have the anthropologist's eye at that point of time, but it sort of struck us suddenly. And, even I think it was catastrophic for 400 million workers who were there in India, but it was devastating, particularly devastating for the 139 million migrant workers. These numbers are numbers that were given to who, but these numbers might be completely off base because we don't have any numbers for migrants registration. So these are all guess estimates. But and again, the data is not age or gender desegregated data. So, we have all these lumps and have been trying to piece together as to what is happening. Now, after that, the narrative is very familiar, I think, to all of us. So I will not talk about, the different stages of lockdown and what happened. But what I will begin with is different categories. What does it mean to be living within a bordered community? Where is the border? Because this whole notion of migrant workers have completely, turned the notion of border upside down. Nargis was talking about transnational migration and how the border does not exist in the way that, because nobody can cross the border. So unless what is a border? A border is that space that makes it possible for you to go from one region to another, from one country to another. But we completely changed our notions of border through this pandemic, because borders were erected everywhere as a result of lockdown. And what happened to the migrant worker? Now, if you look at historically, the whole notion of public health and mobility, if you look at plague or even more recently Ebola, you will see that historically health management has been an aspect of urban management, particularly in times of pandemic. So, so health came, was a close subordinate. Health was was never
Paula, would you want to switch off
So
your?
I do not fault to stop mobility for safety. Nothing is switched on in my.
No.
Okay,
Would you
wait.
like to switch off your video in case
Yeah.
your audio is not stable? I mean, if, for the network, because we are losing
But can
you.
you hear me? Can you hear me otherwise?
We missed your bit in between. So yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Just in case.
So yeah, I can switch off the video. I have no problems. But let's see how long it goes. So what I'm saying is it overturned our notions of border. Because normally what happens is that we are used to border management, particularly if it's an international border. And the migrants were supposedly citizens. But the fact that this whole notion of citizenship is very variegated is clearly brought out by the situation of the migrants as a result, of the border. And, our whole notion of looking at questions of migration was revolutionized because we have always talked about how ethics of care, Carol Gilligan, Nelnet, all these people, and how they have used ethics of care. But I think this is where we sort of erred because care was secondary. We did not invoke the ethics of justice. And unless we invoke the ethics of justice, we cannot appropriate a space of care. So, the notion of border was revolutionized and international border was replicated within internal borders. And it was not exclusive to India. The same thing happened in European Union. European Union was supposedly the SARS frontier, SARS border region, but again, borders were erected within that. And it was clearly, we had shades of citizenship where certain groups of citizens were considered as, at secondary. And this whole process of alienization of refugees that we've been talking about was now replicated on a category of people who are actually citizens. Now, the interesting thing is, look at the two terms that we invoked out of this, pandemic situation. The two most used terms were social distancing and essential workers. Okay, so India is used to social distancing. We have always done social distancing happily for centuries. Just look at the history of caste. And we have, without any sensitivity, appropriated this term. We didn't even question, what does it actually mean to be socially distanced? And the other concept was that of essential workers, frontline workers, essential workers. Now, if you look at the migrants, they were the essential workers because they could they could send remittances back home, on which large sections of the village economy was based on. So the migrants were treated historically as essential to their community. When they came back home, they brought money, they brought largesse, etc. And who were the socially distanced? The people who were now the frontline workers. So this pandemic again reversed that whole notion. So now we are talking about the previously socially distanced as the frontline workers without really abrogating any ethics of justice on them, and asking for ethics of care, receiving care from them without imparting care or justice, because this is, if you look at all these notions, it is based on a mutual reciprocity. But here we suspended all kinds of reciprocity, and the migrants became what Anupama was talking about, the stigmatization of the migrants. So the migrants were the subjects of the socially distanced. So, and so the migrants leave an area, all migrations is based on this, forced migration as well. You are forced to leave, or you leave an area because you seek a life of dignity. And herein, I think I question this notion of circular migration that we were talking about. This was not circular migration. This was abandonment because you sought dignity. And that is why the migrants left. But, it is, so even if it's return, it's a re-turn. It's a different turn altogether. And, these migrants who were now the stigmatized alien population, abrogated almost, their whole notion of citizenship. They were no longer that citizen. They were sort of a subset of citizen. And, and where were the borders? So what did the migrants do? The migrants started challenging the borders, and in a way, for seeking a life of dignity, they started braving death. So they started their long march towards a life of dignity. So, you know, and very correctly, as Nargis was saying, we were the witnesses, and sort of, I have seen this Gaulish sentiment among a lot of middle class people switching on their television and asking how many died. So, we have become so insensitive that, it is no longer the person, the body, the migrant, it is merely a number. That, the state has created this paradigm where we have accepted it wholesale, that these people were a mere number. And that is why, this numbers game actually, in certain ways, sort of made it possible for the state to, look at these migrants as individuals rather than as citizens. There is a theoretical, discourse where we talk about why individual rights become so problematic, particularly in the notions of public health, because, the moment you talk about individual rights, that helps you to marginalize certain communities from the discourse. Because, in a communitarian way, if you seek rights, it is more powerful than if you seek rights from the state from an individual perspective. So the moment you treat it as an individual, as an alien, the state does not feel responsibility of planning, of providing that rights. So look at what, even now, even today, how we look at the whole notion of movements of the migrants. Ask any state functionaries and you will be told that we are running so many hundreds of Shramik special trains, and 60 lakh people have gone, without understanding that this is not bare bodies that we are talking about. This is people who are entitled to rights. These are people who are entitled to rights, and they are actually the essential workers that are needed in the cluster, the urban clusters. Even now, now that we are opening up, there's again a demand for them. Now, interestingly, I have often asked myself that whether I am doing sort of a category of vulnerabilities is when I look at this whole notion of migration, which itself is, as I said, completely turned on its head. It's like an Alice in Wonderland situation. And, but what is worse is that, look at what is, if you use your feminist lens, it becomes even more complicated. Even researchers were sensitive, like Prabhu Mahapatra yesterday was talking about migration, which is very much male. But today, Anupama brought out a category where a lot of work has been done. We are so insensitive, we don't even think about that. And that is marriage migration. huge number of women migrate as a result of marriage. But even when we as social scientists are thinking of policies or thinking of research on the basis of that, we completely, obliterate that from our sensitivity. Because if we bring that category, then the majority of migration is not young men anymore, and the thing is, all through this process of migration, by addressing the vulnerabilities of migrant communities, or trying to address and failing miserably, we have completely shed our feminist lens also. We're not even asking the question about, deaths as to how many women died as a result of this. Where are, age-wise, what is the differences? And this is important because this is a session on methodology. And these are the questions that we need to ask. Because, as I said, research on migration studies have been turned on its head as a result of pandemic, because we are no longer talking about refugees or aliens. We are making our own citizen the refugees, because they are being thrown out of places, they are being forced to cross border, they are being stopped at the border, they have to show their papers at the borders. You are a citizen of this country, yet every border you have to stop, you have to show the paper. Often you're quarantined within the border, and then you can, when you reach the place where you sought dignity from, you are stopped there, you're quarantined there, and you are told that you only come back when you are in trouble, and when you become that object who can spread, or that object of stigma, who is a carrier of, the disease. Now, remember what we did with Ebola, SARS. That is exactly what we are doing to internal migrants now. Always, pandemic never begins at home. Always we source it to the outside. The threat is always from the outside. And that is how we erect borders, we erect border walls. And what I have been talking about this, we've all been talking about this, that the way the states have erected international borders and the way national security has been projected as a result of that, it automatically leads to shrinking borders. Partition happened because we wanted to stop all partition, but actually it sort of went on to create multiple partitions as a result of that. And today, the way we have erected borders, the way we have created the paradigm of national security, we have actually made it possible for states to bring those borders down and then shrink it to an extent where a city has its border, a state has its border, and rendered as refugees. So, public health, questions of public health, questions of pandemic has brought all these newer categories of looking at, issues. These categories did not exist before. These categories are new categories. And then if we look at, refugees who are actually refugees, who are not citizens, today's protracted refugee is fast becoming stateless. So every category, if you look at it, that is why I talked about variegated citizenship. Every category is losing a notch of its entitlement, is losing a notch of its rights as a result of the state configuration of policies on the basis of pandemic. A major example of this are the laws that have been, that we were talking about yesterday, that is happening in Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, Uttar Pradesh, where labor rights have now become, what we used to critique as rights of SEZs. Hours are increasing, hire and fire, no assurance of job. And interestingly, our research of migration has to take into account that the great let's so migration research happens simultaneously with migrations, different kinds of migration. And today now we are seeing that after these people, the migrants workers had come home, they have figured that their ghar, as Prabhu was saying, their ghar is no longer their ghar because they do not have that dignity. And what is happening is that they are now poised to probably return. I don't know. Again, I'm using the term return with an hyphen within it because that will be a new kind of movement. The scariest part is I was doing a little research on Amphan and this whole return migration, etc. What I'm looking at, what I'm seeing in the context of Bengal, I'm sure that is also true for the rest of India, and that is the age of migrants will drop drastically. Because those who have come back, the largely people of my generation, are so exhausted, so fatigued, so sick, that younger people from their homes would be thrown into this uncertain milieu of migration. Today, in the research area, in my area, I see 14-year-old girls getting ready to migrate. And without, Nasreen, how much time do I have? Can't hear you. You're muted.
Couple of minutes, is that okay?
Yeah, I'll sum up. So today, what we are seeing is that the age of migrant workers, particularly the age of women migrant workers, is becoming lower and lower. And interestingly, traffickers are looked upon as your friend because they will make it possible for you to cross the internal border and go to the urban centers. So, as a result of this pandemic, if you look at pedagogy, the whole categories and criteria have now completely turned on its head. We are no longer, we can talk of international borders because your internal borders have now acquired the character of international border. The category of citizen have been given up for a toss. The migrant workers who are citizens have now become the aliens. And what about the question of gender? We have always been saying that, to do a research on gender, pretty much you have to inform your research with certain ethical dimensions. But your bare life is at stake here. So where do you bring in ethics? Where do we get in these dimensions? Where can we use the prism of gender? Because the entire category of migrants now, in terms of entitlement, have been feminized, have been shown of, entitlements, so much so that they are no longer, or they can no longer deemed as to be citizens, but rather they have become that alien worker who is a stigmatized person who brings in the alien diseases. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. As usual, you have raised very, very important and poignant points. And I think the whole assertion of border, I think, is very, very timely. That's something that we have all accepted it in some way without even problematizing it. So yes, of course, the concept of border, the way it's been internalized, along with ethics of care, and two very important aspects, the social distancing. I mean, that's something maybe, Vishwajit, we need another seminar or another panel on another set of issues, because this is such an interesting conversation that, we would just love to continue. I don't know about you, but this is such a privilege to listen to a conversation which is we are experiencing, but also something that we are also learning a lot. So I think somewhere there are, the set is the stage is set. I'm not going to stand between the questions and your speaker. So I open the floor for questions. So yes, please.
Yeah, questions are invited, or we can say that the questions that has been raised by our panelists, and can those questions be answered by each one of them if they wish to? If that can be one of the formats that yeah, Nargis.
I had a question to dear Paula and also maybe the rest of our panel. Now, I mean, it's my genuine belief that in order for scholarship to have transformative effect and to create both intellectual and political space, it really needs to perpetually authenticate itself in terms of the communities and individual lives that it deals with. So, I mean, going back to both presentations other than mine, under the circumstances when we cannot really relate to these communities and cannot become interlocutors in the more traditional sense, how do we perform that role of being authentic interlocutors between these communities and society at large and the state? I'm just asking actually a very practical question. I think there was a suggestion that diaries were kept by women who were abandoned. And then do we then become interpreters of these diaries and publishers of these notes? In terms of the examples Paula gives, I think the Indian example is very pertinent, the multiple and perpetual partitions and what's happening in between states. But then again, how do we get our data? How do we reach out under pandemic circumstances? Part of the reason why I'm asking this question is this condition is meant to continue for another 8 months to a year. And the tally of the debt and the decimated will increase. And then this is what we've been investing our lives for 20, 30 years. So how do we situate ourselves while we're also forced to be isolated, not just from our communities, but from also the communities that we work with?
Do you want me to reply?
Can we get a few more questions? If nobody's asking, I can ask. So I'm not I would love to use the privilege of the chair and ask questions, but I don't want to monopolize. Vishwajit will not like that as a host. Yeah. So here's your chance to ask questions. So I get to ask my questions and then, all right, never mind. I'll ask my questions. I mean, I think it's more of a conversation. I think what all three of you have done is, you've kind of raised the question of categories, which is so pertinent in terms of any kind of pedagogy that we look at. And the confusion that I think what we are facing as not just, as scholars of migration studies or forced migration or citizenship, is common people when they are asking, they don't differentiate between a migrant and a citizen and an internal migrant and whatnot. How does one, look into this whole gamut of thing and really do research, which is something, let's say what Anupama was saying, that, marriage migration, everybody knows about it. And yet the research output seems to be, it's only now that we talk about, domestic violence becoming a part of it. So this has been going on for a really, really long time. So my question is, how do we make the work or the category that we're using, if lack of a better word, sellable, because it's so pertinent that we understand, and the common people out on the street, I mean, 3 words that everybody understands is social distancing, essential workers, as Paula was mentioning, essential and non-essential, lockdown, unlock, lock. So all these terminologies are there, but how do you weave that in terms of the methodological narrative that we're building? It's for all 3 of you to comment, actually.
Actually, I think herein comes the question of visibility and invisibility that we were discussing from yesterday. A lot of these categories have been used before. We have a historical context for these categories. But today, suddenly we have transformed these categories with examples taken from the present situation to an extent where we have actually eroded the rights of these, people live within these categories, So I think it is a lose-lose game. It's not a win-win game at all, the way we have transformed these categories. Because and in every state, as I said, one notch of rights, or maybe sometimes multiple notches of rights, is getting eroded. So, we have to counter these narratives with the historical narratives that we have. History can be used as a tool to counter the narratives that we are getting, or challenge the narratives. And, Nargis, what, the other thing that, I would like to point out is that these migrant workers, a lot of them were not from the, let's say manufacturing sector, or, all these, formal, informal sectors, but from a lot of them, most of them were from very informal sectors. And when we see these, the informality is related to their proximity to the private space. And because of that proximity, if we use our lens, our gender lens, it becomes easier to address these. If there is one take that I have from this, is that it, by using the lens of gender, it becomes easier, or at least more acceptable, these notions of vulnerability, which otherwise, without using the lens of gender and the lens of intersectionality, we will not be able to address at all.
Yeah, and Nasreen, can I come in? Can I come in, Nasreen? Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I would respond to Nasreen's question, and if Nasreen permits me a couple of questions, I can see in the chat box. So very briefly, there is, I would feel that as researchers who go into the field, there is always this. Kind of a predisposition to go into the field with categories that have become settled in our minds. Now, this is a category that I perhaps want to see in the field, and one needs to be sensitive, perhaps, to the category that the field itself throws up. And so in the context of abandoned women, for example, one of the category of vulnerability was explained through what the women told us, but the kind of narratives that were structured by each woman of her experience of abandonment threw up different kinds of categories as well. So whereas there was resonance with the conceptual forms that one could find. For example, Sarah Ahmed's affect alien seemed to be very prominently coming out in the experiences of one of the women. But there were other kinds of categories that were thrown up where the idea of migration being like a bhav sagar. So there is an immediate reference to leaving the physical world to go to be able to go into another world which would be more promising in terms of the returns again that world would give you. So the use of the word Bhav Sagar as an enticement to migrate was something that came from the field. And in my research in Cooch Behar, for example, the category that became extremely important in the context of one of the camps was Bharat Panthi. And for a returnee who was an Indian citizen and was coming into India, leaving behind the land that he was living in, the idea that he came because he made the decision to come because he was a Bharat Panthi became important. So the categories that the field throws up, and then those categories become important. In connection with this, there's a question that was raised by Skylab in the Zoom chat where she says, what about welfare for registered students, registered migrants? And maybe welfare, yes, but what the workers are looking for is work and not welfare. So again, what kind of category do we use in order to push for certain kind of policies? So whether Manrega or whether cash transfers. So those are the kind of dilemmas that I think we are confronted with. There's another question on marriage migration of transnational female migrants, and can this be used? That kind of research be done in the internal context as well? Yes, and it has been done in the context of Haryana and Bengal and Kerala. So that research also exists, and that would be a very useful research to do.
Nargis, you want to comment something?
I mean, I actually got stuck on one comment that came from the floor in the chat section. And while I'm listening to Professor Roy and Paula, I'm also thinking about that question, which is one of our participants suggested that we should have had state representatives express their ideas about the response to the pandemic. And there are panels and academic conglomerations whereby you include policymakers and state departments dealing with the subject. But it's not just a matter of optics or equality, because the relationship between state and society is not an egalitarian one. The state has access to all the organs of representing its ideas and defending its policies. So in a way, the kind of space that we have where we can ask questions that are not immediately answerable, that cannot be directly related to policy measures or budgetary constraints, it's really essential to have that kind of space. And I would like our students to think about what I'm just saying. It doesn't mean to exclude official views or data, but those are readily available, and there are all manner of institutional and formal channels for people to understand what representatives of the state think about these issues. So, and then that goes back to, the role of the scholar as an interlocutor. And we're talking about communities, whether migrant workers or refugees or asylum seekers or stateless people. Those people don't have representation by and large. And under pandemic circumstances, they're even more underrepresented. So I don't know. I mean, it's a question mark. I'm divided on that, but I do feel that these kinds of platforms really are part of the societal spectrum of being able to ask questions and engage with official narratives and policies.
Do we have any more questions in the chat box? I don't see any.
So on the diaries, Nargis, I was referring to diaries in terms of visual diaries that were kept by journalists. So I'm not referring to diaries that were kept by migrants themselves. I don't know of them.
Oh, I see. Okay, so that's entirely different.
Yeah, in terms of the visual chronicling of the migration process. So that's
actually very interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
Ashiji, do you have a question? I'm sure you would love to ask, considering you've been very silent throughout 2 days.
No questions at all. I'm enjoying this talk by each one of them, and it's actual treat for me to listen to all these brilliant speakers who, in their own ways, explicated the complexities involved in researching migration as a study. So the whole question of interdisciplinarity and mixing of methods, that is very striking to researchers who are trying to do migration studies. So borrowing from anthropology, borrowing from urban studies, borrowing from architecture, so many things that we can combine together to understand migration. Because migration itself is a complex process. It's not that you just, there's a simple pull factor, there's a simple push factor. So those power relationship engraved in all aspects of migrant laborers' life, or whether it's a laborer or anyone. Those are interesting questions. Those have been brought out by these three speakers. So, but I just have a one question to ask to three of them, that when you are going to field, that Anupama stated that we go always with some kind of predisposition, but it's not always true that we go, but there are certain things that change in the field, and
Yeah.
sometimes you may not be, sometimes you may not be part of that field, as you say, that is a participative process, but sometimes you may feel alien from the whole case of participation. Why I'm saying, because while I'm studying Kalinganagar movement, when I went there, I was not allowed to be part of that phenomena for at least 1 month, because I was an alien to them. Right. So how do we deal with this alien nature of researcher and the investigation or research that you want to conduct in the field?
So was that for me, Viswajit?
It is for Nargis and Anupama both.
Okay.
Poladi also. Anyone can answer.
Want to take it up for 2-3 minutes, please?
Yeah.
Then there's one more question I think we have for Paula from Skylab, but that's okay. Yes, please go ahead. Anupama?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the problem of the conducting an anthropological research would be extremely difficult for and I don't claim to have conducted an anthropological research. I have used the anthropological research to be in a site. In a kind of a field visit. So it's not as if there is a prolonged association with the field or a return to the field. So whereas the site is construed as anthropological, the research itself cannot be. So in a way, none of us was immersed in the field. So and the kind of contact that we had with the women in the field was also individual. So in the sense that one needed to hunt for those women, and through particular kind of sources, and the limits of reaching those women. For example, we looked at court documents first, and then the FIRs that were filed in the NRI police stations. So our research was already limited by the way in which we contacted those women. But there was also no intention in this research to be part of their experience. No, it was clear that we are just going to listen to them and speak after them. But there was always an expectation, considering that we'd come from Delhi. So that itself is an expectation. Also, the fact that we had talked to so many other women like her. So there is a kind of a nebulous collective that is already formed in the mind of that woman, and how her experiences kind of gel with other experiences of other women. So that kind of a co-participation is what I was talking about. And that co-participation happened because of a sustained interaction, but not the kind of interaction that perhaps, I'm thinking of Nonika Datta's book, The Daughter's Testimony, which was almost a year long and maybe a longer interaction that she had with one woman, and the outcome was that book. So the co-participation part is about the woman being aware that this is the kind of research that we are doing, and the purpose of the research is perhaps this. But there was always a sense of catharsis in the woman who was talking to us, because no one was sitting on judgment to the story that she told us. And while we prompted, she was the person who was in control of her story. And that story that she told us was not structured in a way that she would perhaps tell her lawyer, or she would perhaps tell the police who was filing the FIR. So in one instance, for example, we found remarkable differences in the way in which the personal narrative was told to us and the legal documents that we got for that case. So those are the kind of things perhaps that we can do with the research, the kind of research that no one did. Yeah, thank you.
The co-host seemed to have stopped my video. Okay, now I can start my video. Yeah, I want to address Bishwajit's question, because I feel very, very, Bishwajit, hello. I feel very, very seriously about it, because, I don't believe in objective research, because we don't have to come with any presupposition. Our presupposition is built in us. We are products of our time, products of our, understanding and beliefs. I cannot shed my feminist lens and get into a research and say I'll be objective. That, my location is also very, very important in the kind of research that I will do. So I'm really, Bishwajit, against your view of an objective research. I'm not an objective person. I don't know if anybody can do an objective research. I don't think it's possible. I think all research is subjective, very frankly.
Agnes?
Okay, so I'm just going to continue this conversation a little further. Now I'm trained in multiple disciplines, but even if I wasn't trained, I think as an observer of social reality and political reality, we have to engage with different dimensions. So one of the things that I do and I encourage with the people that I work with is you don't have to rely on interviews. There are many forms of testimonies that are coming out. At the moment, I'm very closely reading diaries of healthcare professionals or obituaries of healthcare workers who are dying in camps and prisons and whatnot. There's so much fact that's available out there that reaches to our hands through different means. Similarly, changes in policy cycles, the kind of panic that the state actually exhibits, and the wording that comes out in ministerial language, or the kinds of approaches religious leaders take concerning how they define a community. So it may not speak to a standard anthropological training, but I think we have to be synthetic in our approach in absorbing all the information that is coming out of social reality, in addition to interviews and other traditional methods of eliciting knowledge. Finally, I'm a great fan of institutional and legal ethnography, which looks at transformative practices from within institutions and the language that's used in law and policy and receptions of that legal consciousness. And all that data, you don't necessarily need to go and talk to the judge. You actually have access to the documentation that's coming out of courts. In the geographies I work with, we have tens of lawyers who are actually on hunger strike. These are defense lawyers. and their families are delivering their letters to the public. So what I'm saying is, I mean, in a way, there are so many ways of reaching out to what's happening, in addition to the face-to-face. And Professor Roy just highlighted another one, which is the visual diaries of journalists of what's happening, because sometimes in regimes which are heavy-handed, you can't publish this stuff, but you document otherwise. So I think we should all encourage each other to engage in multiple forms with what's happening. As far as what Paula says, I'm fully in agreement, but also I'm going to go back to decades ago, you know, my first round of training in epistemologies and methodologies, and that is to say, you've got to be honest about where you're starting from. And I was partially trained as a historian, and that was even more so at a time when historical facts were expected to speak for themselves, and we were taught, no, they don't. And if you do that, you're basically letting the state speak, or the dominant classes speak. Nothing speaks of itself. So I think there's also a job on our part of acknowledging where we're starting and what questions are ailing us and why. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much. I would like this conversation to continue, but I think we should kind of, you know, we unfortunately, there is a question. Is that a question, Pradeep Kumar Nath? Oh, we feel, okay, it's more like a, you know, observation. All right. So unfortunately, we have to end the conversation, at least in this forum. Maybe we can continue, you know, in a different way. So I strongly encourage, you know, to kind of, you know, continue this conversation, which, I mean, these speakers you don't get, to be very honest, as in, you know, to get them all together in one forum is really hard, and the virtual world has made that possible. So I think I'm very, very, you know, privileged to kind of be party to it and to chair it. I mean, if at all, I think we moderate it. But thank you so much. And I will leave it to Vishwajit now to take it over from here. But on a personal note, thank you to all the three speakers. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you,
you.
Nasreen. Thank you, Nasreen, and all the three panelists. And it's a really interesting subject on methodology. I think we can have another full one-day session on methodology and migration studies. That would be very interesting, and we can have a host of speakers on this. So Samalenduda has also joined us through video. I request him if he can say a few words. Samarinda?
Absolutely, Shamalinda, you should.
Can you just say a few words? Yeah.
Visibility dorkar.
An excellent experience I had for the last 2 days. I joined this particular, you know, from the very beginning, from the very first minute. What is really quite a rewarding experience for me, because most of the speakers have raised certain questions which would you know, sort of inspire you to carry on your own research further, and it's very fruitful. I wish many from Calcutta could have joined this particular endeavor, but somehow I don't know, they were not properly informed perhaps, and that was my fault, because my college is almost in a non-operative mode, so I couldn't reach out to my friends properly. Anyway, this last part, only one thing I really felt like saying, that this border is a very shrinking concept. You know, basically, when you are talking about districts, when you're talking about state, I mean, it's much smaller, because in a village, when the migrant labor tends to come back, he's not even allowed to enter the village proper. He or they are kept outside in a particular ground adjacent to the village. Moreover, if any person who has contacted COVID, he has come back from some other place as a migrant laborer, the moment he enters his own house, is allowed to enter his own house, he is becoming a prisoner, because villagers will not allow him to come out. This is, I mean, border is a very fluid concept now. I don't know what border really stands for. Thank you. That is all I have to comment about. But an excellent experience, I must say. Very well organized, fruitful, excellent participation, extremely encouraging. I'm really grateful to this in your colleague, Mr. I've forgotten Delhi University and
Deshbandhu College.
Displaced College for organizing this wonderful event. Excellent. I'm really having a fantastic experience. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Samalanudha, and I formally